We are now joined by Lieutenant Colonel James Carafano. He is a leading expert in national security and foreign policy challenges and the Vice President of Heritage Foundation's Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy and the E.W. Richardson Fellow. Lieutenant Colonel Carafano, welcome to Breitbart News Sunday.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
All right. Now, I follow you on Twitter and I see your comments on a lot of things. The most amazing story of the last couple of weeks to me, it's really a story about the media more than anything else, but is this story about the bounties in Afghanistan. Apparently, according to reports, there's some intelligence that Russia might be paying Taliban or others in Afghanistan to kill American soldiers, and somehow this wasn't acted upon. That appears to be the basis of the charge against the Trump administration. What do you make of all this?
Well, there's a number of different ways to come at this story. Let's start with what we know about the Russians. Is it plausible that the Russians would do something like this? And the answer is yes. This is a tactic that the Soviets did. Putin employs many of the same tactics. The GRU, which is the political military arm of the Russian armed forces, this is the kind of stuff they do. The Russians would like to see the U.S. fail in Afghanistan, which is really kind of weird because a stable Afghanistan is actually good for Russia. And so in the sense of Russia trying to destabilize how the U.S. exit, it actually doesn't make sense, except for the fact that the Russians just would like to see America fail. So it's a possible credible allegation, but here's all the things kind of missing from the New York Times story that broke the news. So this was which the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, the Chief of Staff, everybody has acknowledged that there is an ongoing investigation, intelligence operation into this allegation. Almost everything else in the story that the New York Times put together is really about creating a narrative, and innuendo is based on real facts. So they never really, like you would normally do in a story, do a lot of investigation to determine, what people know and verify different things. Okay, we know it's based on intelligence, like the U.S. government essentially has confirmed that, although they apparently don't know who leaked it. But you would do things like call the White House and say, do you have any comments? They claim the president was briefed. Was the president briefed? The New York Times didn't do any of this. They just spun this narrative. And then we kind of launched into the story from there.
So we've had this sort of mainstream media scandal, and that's kind of where it's remained, but this idea that Donald Trump is trying to please Vladimir Putin and so wouldn't object to Putin paying jihadis to kill American soldiers. The accusation's so preposterous. Now, the Trump administration says that the president was never briefed about this. Now we find out there was some dispute about whether the intelligence was accurate, and the administration's saying now we may never know because it came out in the New York Times, which means that the people that the intelligence was picking up are now going to change what they do. They're going to hide what they do. We may never know what actually happened with this.
Right. So here's two things that if the New York Times was actually doing real investigative reporting, one of the things that you would do is you would add context. What do we know? And there are two things which they don't discuss at all in the article, which are actually quite factual. One is we know that this administration has actually been incredibly tough on the Russians. If the Russians were so pleased with what we were doing in Afghanistan, why would they be trying to screw it up? This administration's actually been really tough on the Russians in arms control. We're really tough in terms of building up NATO. We've actually haven't given them any ground in Syria. There's a long, long list of areas where this administration actually has done all kinds of things that Putin hates, which is why you have Russians running around all over the world today trying to mess with the United States. It's not because President Trump is doing their bidding. It's exactly the opposite. American policy is actually the opposite of what Putin wants. None of that's in the story. The other thing, which is look at the president's track record. I go back to the case of Soleimani. In the case, we had intelligence, which was confirmed that the Iranians were actually directing terrorist attacks to kill Americans in Iraq. We identified that Soleimani was actually in charge of that operation. We caught him in Iraq, red-handed, directing terrorist attacks to kill Americans, and the president ordered him taken out. In Syria, forces were sent against Americans, and some of them actually were probably Russian mercenaries. The president had them taken out. In every confirmable instance where the United States needed to take an action to defend the lives of American soldiers, this president did that. So virtually everything this president has done runs counter to the narrative suggested in the story. And a real news report would have actually put that context in there instead of essentially doing what we've done, because what's most disturbing about this story is it fits a pattern that we have seen over and over and over again in the story about Ukraine and Russian scandals. Somebody leaks some intelligence. The news agency takes that. They string together a narrative which is contrary to the president. They put that out there, and then it becomes essentially the thing that has to be disproved. So I thought one of the most interesting comments was they said, well, the president wasn't briefed. And then very quickly, a whole series of administration officials came out and said, no, this is not confirmed intelligence. This is not the kind of thing you would present to the president to make a decision, like in the case of Soleimani. It's not the kind of thing we would tell the president. And so Adam Schiff goes out and very immediately says, oh, well, we all know that the intelligence community doesn't tell the president things he doesn't want to hear. So the New York Times lie was wrong. So he just throws out an alternative theory, of course, for which he has no evidence whatsoever. And I think fair-minded people, who knows the motive of the people that write these articles and everything else, but this is a pattern that we've seen. You leak something, they build a narrative, and then it falls upon the U.S. government to actually disprove that the narrative was true.